much for your patience, and it's great that Tim has arrived. Tim is in the building. So Tim, I was just telling people about the chapter in your book where you write about the coal miner's son and needing to take the next step with the light that you have. And I think right at the end of that chapter, Tim says, take the step with the light that you have, walk in that light, it's sufficient. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Tim Costello, who is one of Australia's most sought after voices on social justice, leadership and ethics. Since 2004, Tim has been the CEO of World Vision, Australia's largest international development agency. Tim has practiced law, served as a Baptist minister, and has been very active in the church and community leadership, local government and national affairs. So it's with great pleasure to have Tim with us today to set the scene for what community can be. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and apologies, I'm late. This is a big conference, there were no car parks. So that's my excuse. It's a delight to be here and to be introduced in that way. I wrote a book that you referred to, Hope, largely because I was troubled. I was troubled that I have never seen Australians so grumpy and polarised and aggressive and feeling dismal. A lot of it has to do with Canberra and the political leadership, really on both sides. The negativity, really what I felt was a loss of perspective, which is why talking about communities today actually fits with why I also wrote this book. That when we step back and think about where we are in world history, we are still blessed. All of us in this room, and this might shock you, are in the top 1% of the richest people in the world. I know you think that's Gina Rinehart and Rupert Murdoch. They're the 0.1% richest. But we are all in the top 1% of the richest people in the world. When you lose perspective, you actually only compare yourself downwards to someone who's earning more, who's doing better. We rarely compare ourselves upward. I don't know if there are any men in this room who are 6'4" or above. Hands up if there are any. Not one. Oh well, there you go. If you're 6'4" or above, you're in the top 1% of the tallest people in Australia, in fact in the world. If you're 6'4" and you meet someone who's 7 foot, you suddenly feel very small. Wow, look at his size. The truth is though, you haven't got any smaller. You are still in the top 1% of the tallest men on the planet. This is constantly what we do when we lose perspective about how blessed we are in Australia. When we're in the top 1% and we know of people around us who are earning more and doing better, we suddenly feel poorer. We actually didn't get any poorer. Do you get my point? It's just that suddenly we are comparing ourselves, as we always do, with those who are doing better. We rarely compare ourselves with those who are smaller. 6'4" men, when they meet a 5'6" man, don't suddenly say, well, that makes me much taller. They're still knowing they're 6'4". Well, I think this is really important when we think about community, because community is the basic quality of human life that gives us perspective, that allows us to swap stories, to make a sense of our place, both at the high end or the low end, both when we've got full health or we've got disabilities, when we've got different coloured skin and religion and ethnic background and language differences. Community is actually the place where we sort out who we are, get perspective, understand how we live our lives. It's a very basic quality of human life, and yet community's meaning has changed over time. We all know it's profoundly human to live together, to form groups, to share with each other, to support each other. There's a few odd exceptions. There's hermits, anchorites are sometimes called, but for the rest of us, they're the exception. Community is the natural state, across cultures, across historical times, giving us perspective on what it means to be human. That is the great advantage of community. It takes many forms. It's family, it's membership derived from ties of blood or kinship. What tribalism is, and I travel to Africa a lot, is that sense of kinship and blood and culture that decides who's in and who's out, because the safety net when a disaster befalls you, when you're struggling, is that tie of kinship. And you don't want to let everybody in, because then too many people can make a claim on you when disaster befalls. Actually, tribe is a safety net of how many we can cope with and what's our primary ethical responsibility. Well, we don't talk of tribes in Australia unless we're talking football. And being an Essendon supporter, I'm not going to be talking football. Today is Judgment Day for my tribe. But community is that experience in family, in village, in town, in religion, of actually sort of working out our tribe and who we belong to and what our duties are, and then working out perspective on where we stand. Of course, the nation is community on a grand scale. Some people have said a nation is just people tied together by a geographical identity with a common fear and hatred of their neighbours. It's a pretty pessimistic view, but there is some truth in it. Tribe is being tied together by blood with a fear and hatred of other tribes and neighbours. Football has some of that in it. There are accidental communities, the bonds we share with people we never expected to share a bond. And we find something in common, and it's a joy and gift and surprise. And I think you've all had those experiences. Sometimes the bonds are because we went to school with them. They're in our neighbourhood. Or on a holiday 20 years ago, we just clicked and we've stayed in a communal relationship with them. Today, community is reappearing in new forms, and the idea of community is coming up against new challenges. As we look ahead 10, 20, 30 years, do we see a future for communities as we know them, or will they be virtual communities? Groups of people communicating with each other in 140 character messages. Will the communities of the future be self-selecting? We'll just edit out anyone who's different to us and really have a tight sense of we actually are the same and we feel comfortable with that. Or will we allow people who challenge us, maybe even disturb our thinking, into our community? I hope we will. You don't get perspective when it's just the same people. When we lose perspective, we become grumpy and we evaporate hope. Well, I hope that we will continue to recapture the genius of communities of old. In village communities of old, everyone, regardless of their background or wealth or any other characteristic, had the opportunity, in fact the need, to rub up against others, even if they were different. In country towns, everyone has an almost primary relationship, even with the town drunk. When it's small and you can't avoid the town drunk, you actually have to find a way of relating. It's very interesting in urban life. Primary relationships are more difficult because of the speed of our relationships. We might say, "G'day, how you doing?" to the checkout chick, but if she actually starts to give us an answer, she becomes a menace. People behind us get furious. It's a secondary relationship. We don't really want a primary relationship with her. It's just a form of words from village days. How are you going? We don't wait for the answer. When we travel on public transport, it is amazing if you've travelled on packed trams or trains. Your face can be so close to the person you're standing next to. You know what they had for breakfast. But we have developed a very urban, sophisticated skill of totally ignoring their existence. We do it to survive. There's too many relationships and community. If we opened ourselves up to the question, who are you and how are you going, could be overwhelming. Speed and efficiency in a market actually disintegrates some of that. So we develop protective skills where that person whose face is 6 inches away from us on the train literally is invisible, and we are to them. That's a pretty amazing and it's a pretty scary skill to have. Well, maybe I'm oversimplifying things because I think today's communities still include a large interaction with diverse people, and they need to. Our communities of the past weren't perfect either. In a country town, if you ended up pregnant, the shame and the gossip meant you fled to the city, and the city actually was, with its anonymity, a relief from shame and stigma. We don't want to simply idealise the past, but I think we can see there are trends. There is a trend, and we need to name this, towards greater individualism. It's a result of a consumer society where we measure our consumption in efficiency and therefore secondary, not primary relationships. The speed and the collection of things and people are just incidental. My wife's mother used to shop at the South Melbourne market, and she would always stop for a chat with people. She died before I married my wife, so I didn't know her. The fishmonger and her would sort of flirt, and if she gave him a kiss, she'd get the fish for half price. Now, whatever you think of that story, there is something about actual human relations where you're recognising this isn't just about speed and efficiency, although in those times cost mattered. I tell the story of, in this book, of taking my kids to McDonald's, being really troubled by the fact that everything was fast, including the food now, and having had them in a car where I filled up the tank, walked in, they were young kids in the back, handed over my credit card, signed for the petrol, walked out, got back in the car, roared off, and realised I didn't even utter one word, self-service. And I thought back to when my father had 3 kids in the FJ Holden. He would go then to what was called a garage. Remember that term? And he was a teacher. He'd lift the bonnet and he'd look under it, but we knew he didn't understand a thing about engines. He wasn't fooling us. He was just filling in time till the attendant came. And the attendant would check the oil for him and put air in the tyres and fill up the tank. What I remember is my father always had a conversation. He would talk about footy. He would often get onto politics. My father was a politics teacher, and as you know, there is a little bit of politics in the Costello family. He would crack a joke. What I remember the most was, as a kid, really being proud of the fact that my father could be at ease, have a conversation with a total stranger. It's interesting what you remember as kids, because we went to different garages. And I remember thinking, I hope when I'm older, I have that skill. Being at ease with a total stranger, finding points of community and connection. So here I was at McDonald's, not because I like McDonald's, but my teenage kids at that stage of their life didn't particularly like being seen in public with me. If I was paying at McDonald's, they'd show up. There we were. The girl came up from behind the counter and she had a name tag on. I think her name was Karen. And I said, "Oh, hi, Karen. Are you having a good day? Trying to model something for my kids. She looked a little bit suspicious. I misunderstood her suspicion. I said, "Oh, sorry. Not fair, I know your name. My name's Tim." She now looked profoundly suspicious. I got the order from my kids, and as she was busying herself getting it, I said, "By the way, Karen, do you work here full-time, or is it?" Well, Karen had warmed up a little bit, you know, because I'm obviously a nice guy. And she said, "Well, yeah, I work here full-time," but I said, "Oh, is there going to be a career for you here? Are you going to end up manager?" She said, "No, actually, I only work here to pay the bills. I'm a musician, you know, we're all poor." I thought, wow, this is good. In a very short time, in what's a totally commercial transaction, a bit like my mother-in-law at South Melbourne, she's telling me what matters to her. Isn't that what community's about? She's telling me of her dreams. She's telling me this is actually just a function for her dreams of being a musician. I thought, this is good. I slowly turned round to make sure my kids were absorbing my modelling. Well, to my astonishment and embarrassment, my kids had walked out. They'd had enough. And I sort of got the food, put it down, went out and got them back in and said, "Where did you go?" My daughter turned on me. She said, "You are such a nerd." I said, "What?" She said, "You embarrass us." I said, "How?" She said, "You're not meant to talk to her. You're not meant to call her by name and tell her your name." I said, "Well, sorry. If I'm not meant to talk to her and call her by name, why has she got a name tag on?" My daughter explained, because I obviously was very slow. She said, "Look, she's got a name tag on because if she stuffs up, you know who to report." This was a revelation to me. I thought a name tag was about being personal. No, a name tag is about efficiency, accountability. That's the person who kept me waiting. I thought, isn't it interesting? This is what generational change is. We are looking at the same thing, a name tag. We are placing totally different meanings on it. I thought it was a bit like my mother-in-law's story. It's about being personal. Well, we start to realise that community requires us to talk, to admit that we may have put different spectacles on and think we're looking at the same thing and attach the same meanings. In fact, they're quite different. And there's aha experiences, and then we can overcome misunderstandings and work through what forces are shaping us by shaping those spectacles we put on. Well, the greater trend to individualism is really that whole efficiency market stuff. I like the fact with my mother-in-law and even my bad efforts at McDonald's that yes, it's a commercial relationship, but commerce doesn't define us. Community defines us. Actually trying to know a name, and if it's appropriate, to understand a journey and to share some of our anxiety. What worries me about KPIs, key performance indicators, and the way we go in managing people is we so often are only asking the question, what can they do and what can't they do? Rather than asking the question community asks, what are they anxious about? That's a deeper question. And often with KPIs, it's amazing how many managers expect of people to do things that they're not doing themselves. It's quite extraordinary. The importance of community. What's their burdens? What are the anxieties? I'm frail and fragile, just trying to get through, and so are them. So are they. So when I talk about this individualism, there's nothing wrong with positive individuality, but it must be balanced. It's got to be balanced with obligations toward others, with our intrinsic human need to belong, to share, to share the burden that life is difficult and we are anxious and we are frail and we're not in some competitive race. It's great if each one of us enjoys success, but the good of each of us has to be balanced with the good of all of us. That's the community question, not just individualism, the good of all of us. If we want to understand the future for our communities, we do well to look at how they've changed over the past 50 years, to understand that, and then to try and shape the future, because the need for community will always be a primary human instinct. Community and connectedness has a great history, has a strong value in Australian society. Traditionally, Australians sometimes thought of this in terms of mateship. It referred to comradeship, but mostly among men. In situations of war or disaster, in iconic places as the goldfields and the shearing sheds. That's only one side of the story. But the idea of sticking together, of lending a hand, rolling up your sleeves, is deep in our culture. Our finest moments of community still are fire and flood and sacrifice. And we always say, why can't it be like this always? Well, there are signs that we're not helping each other as much as we used to. In fact, not getting out and participating in community life as much as we used to. In 1967, 33% of Australians were part of a voluntary organisation. By 2006, this was just 18% of Australians. Something had shifted in individualism and looking after myself. Similar declines in joining, whether it's union membership, political party membership, far fewer people attending church. While we still love sport, we seem to love watching it more than actually participating in it. And it's interesting because when the pokies lobby tried to destroy pokies reform that I was advocating, they kept saying, but the pokies provide great community. I discovered that in New South Wales, which has 10% of all the world's pokies, Australia has 21% of all the world's pokies, by the way. You wonder why I speak about this. This is an obscenity that has just been predatory. I discovered that in Queensland, where there are no pokies in towns and suburbs, none outside Burswood Casino, the level of sport participation and community participation was something like 5 times greater than New South Wales, where the clubs were saying it's pokies that bring us community. That was their whole message, and they defeated the reforms of Andrew Wilkie. In some places, especially in our cities, it seems that that fewer of us know our neighbours than before. Andrew Lee has written a book about disconnectedness in Australia, and his research backs this up. It's the cup of sugar test. That is, who could you ask a small favour of? We now know, on average, less than 2 of our neighbours. On Sunday night, Deputy Prime Minister Anthony Albanese gave an interesting insight into this change. He told the story of growing up in Sydney in the 1970s. He was raised by a single mum who suffered serious arthritis. For a couple of months, a year, his mum would be admitted to hospital to adjust and monitor her medication, leaving him at home on his own. So, who looked after him at times like this? He said, the community. It was a very close community in those days. Neighbours would look out for him. They would make sure he had a meal every night. Someone was there every night, and someone he could turn to if there was a problem. Well, you do wonder what's changed from 1970s to now. How many of us could say this would happen in our communities today? It really reminds us of the values of trust in community. In Anthony Albanese's case, it ensured a boy of 12 was safe and could thrive despite very challenging family circumstances. It helped him finish high school, go to university. He's now Deputy Prime Minister. So what's changed? Well, whether it's the advent of television and then new media, The rise of the shopping mall, the culture of consumption as an end in itself, the decline of traditional religion, changing ideas about families and relationships, changing work patterns, longer spent getting to and from work, those forces loosen the ties. And this is really paradoxical, having started with we are in the top 1% richest people in the world, in the richest period of history ever in the world, just to give us perspective. As our wealth has grown, we've lost something more valuable than money. It's the glue that holds community together, the time spent, the care given, the relationships formed through doing things together for a common cause, for a common good. People either are less able or less willing to get involved in the community's life and find themselves increasingly living lonely and fragmented lives, doing things alone that were meant to be done with others. One of the great writers in America, Robert Putnam, his book Bowling Alone, has mapped over the last 25 years what's happened to community in America. The title of the book comes from his discovery that 10-pin bowling is the favourite recreation of a majority of Americans. 25 years ago, they always did it in social groups. It might be work or church groups or youth groups or Rotary, whatever. And after bowling, you'd have pizza and coffee and you would actually talk and share. He said, bowling is still the favourite pastime of Americans today. However, with this difference. Now a majority of Americans are bowling alone. It's interesting, isn't it? What was meant to be done socially is done alone. Actually, he then develops a whole thesis about how this is bad for mental health and violence and imprisonment rates and economic productivity. He studied two regions in Italy, one flourishing economically, the other really failing. They had similar demography and population and economic comparative advantage. So it was a mystery. Why was one flourishing and the other failing? In the end, his main finding was this. The region that is flourishing has this amazing widespread network of choirs. Every village, every group had a choir. And when people came together and sang together, afterwards they talked about, over coffee, the problems with their kids, the problems with their businesses. They found ways out of trust of singing together and the opportunity it provided to actually work entrepreneurially and communally and socially. The other region didn't have community at all like this. That was his main finding for economic prosperity. Well, this is why communities matter. Disconnectedness impacts on all of us in levels of fear and insecurity and violence. It impacts on those who are disadvantaged most, who are marginalised in our society. Looser community ties impacts on informal networks that are essential to supporting those who face the challenge of social exclusion. The bonds of community, by contrast, lead to greater social inclusion. They actually express the Australian value of a fair go for all. People with disabilities and their families are one of the groups in our society who are most at risk of missing out on a fair go, finding themselves on the margins of society. When we think of a fair go, caring for people with disabilities is right at the heart of it. Why? Because disability is the significant marker of social and economic disadvantage in Australia. Mental illness, and you might have heard this on radio last week, is the only illness in the last 60 years where we actually haven't improved the life expectancy of people with that illness. Every single other illness has seen medical advances where they will live longer, but mental illness. 15% of the entire world's population live with a disability. That's 1 billion people. 80% of people living with a disability live in the world's poorest countries. So people with disabilities are the world's largest minority. In some of the very poor communities where World Vision works, disabled people are related to the margins of society. That's why last year, and you might have seen this in our Christmas campaign around child sponsorship, it was the story of Dodik, a young boy in the urban slums of Indonesia who at the age of 12 lost the use of his arms and legs after a bicycle accident. He couldn't walk, he couldn't hold a pen, he couldn't go to school. He just lay on his back. And there in that place, his disability was extraordinary. Well, World Vision focused on getting medical physiotherapy and support for Dodik. And he's now walking with help. All he badly wanted was to get back to school. That was the extraordinary day of his life, and I happened to be there his first day with his parents when he went back to school. The power of that with some simple intervention. People with disabilities rarely get that chance of Dodik in the developing world. Well, I could talk a lot about disability in carers and the fact they're more likely to have low income levels, lower educational attainment, lower participation in the workforce. In fact, PricewaterhouseCoopers cites statistics that indicate Australia has compared poorly in dealing with this with comparable countries. It said, we rank 21 out of 29 rich countries in employment rates for people with disability, and 27th when it comes to to relative poverty risks for people with disability. But I'm sure in this gathering you are quite familiar with a lot of these challenges, and undergirding this isn't just a national disability insurance scheme, but most importantly, a single national approach to disabilities, a sustainable funding model, putting the person with a disability and their family at the centre of the process, and undergirding that needs to be a renewed commitment to community. To say that people who are disabled and their carers are part of our community, and we've looked away, and we haven't understood the struggle, the isolation. So when we think about the future of our communities, I certainly think disability care will help build better communities. But more than that, I hope all of us will actually recommit to more inclusive community wherever we find it, so that we can understand what Putnam was reminding us, that not just our relationships, but even our economy depends on that. Recovering practices of the past that built bonds of trust and connectedness. Celebrating informal, spontaneous community expressions of support. Telling the story. Saying how much it enriches lives, including our lives. Having a close look at technology and social media. It can be a source of disconnectedness, but we know that the story of instant community formed via Facebook during the Tasmanian bushfires, called Tassie Fires We Can Help, was an amazing practical way to actually respond also. This isn't all bad. We have to remember what the human drive is and keep reminding of the bigger story. It's not just a technological story. The paradox, we're more linked into a global society, but the more we need to turn to our local community to restore the balance. To just think of things we can do together, how we can look out for each other, how we can enhance our lives. The final story I tell in this book, Hope, is a story of my grandmother, who had a huge impact on me. For those who've heard me tell it, forgive me telling it again. But she left school in grade 7 and yet was probably the most educated woman I've ever known. She had this thirst for knowledge and curiosity. She could recite poetry for hours. She would write beautiful letters to us, her grandchildren, thoughtful letters that stretched us and suggested books we read and ideas, which I've kept. That's what worries me about emails. Who's going to ever collect emails and put them into bound volumes of correspondence in the future? Something about taking a pen and deliberately and thoughtfully writing and putting a stamp on it. She had this remarkable care for people in her community. On weekends, we'd be over there cooking all day with her, which wasn't much fun for a boy. I'd rather be out kicking the footy. And on Sunday, we'd go to church, we'd have roast dinner, and then we'd pack all this excess food that we cooked into baskets. And with us in train, we'd head out into her community. She lived in Murrumbina. And we'd take casseroles and cakes and food to people who she had heard were doing poorly. That was her word, they're just doing poorly. Today we'd say maybe depressed, maybe a widow or widower, maybe ill. They were doing poorly. If they weren't home, she'd write a note. Otherwise, she would knock on the door and say, just heard that you might need, a bit of a lift, and I just want to leave you this. What amazed me was we were doing this with people, in many cases, she hadn't actually met. And I said, why are we doing this, Grandma? You don't even know these people. And I'll never forget, she said, Tim, this is what you do in community. It was just so simple. Wow. Well, at the age of 84, she had a stroke. She fell into a coma. She was in the coma 8 days. She never came out of it, and then she died. The only words she said in the coma were the words, don't forget to water them geraniums, which was puzzling because she didn't have any geraniums. She had a garden, but no geraniums. I know my mother and her sister and my uncle were sort of, even a bit disappointed that there wasn't something more personal to them that she said. Just water them geraniums. Well, something had dislodged in the brain. You couldn't make sense of that. Her funeral was packed. I was only 24 and privileged to be one of the speakers at it. People out the door. Not typical for an 84-year-old funeral. Here were so many people who'd been touched by her. And it wasn't until a few months after the funeral I discovered, I didn't, my aunt discovered and told me about it, one of her daughters, a Henry Lawson story called Water Them Geraniums. I hadn't read it. No one had remembered Grandma reading it to us. Well, I got the story, I read it. It was a story of this woman who is a battler, raising a tribe of kids in the bush. When the fathers deserted, died, gone droving, but it's a woman on her own, like so much of bush life, bringing up these kids. She is dirt poor. She's having to clothe and educate and feed these kids on her own. There's no social security then. Her story is told through the eyes of a rich neighbour selector. The one thing she has that she's incredibly proud of are her geraniums. Well, like many Lawson stories, she is struck down with an illness. And it's a melancholic end, tragic. She's dying. And as the reader, you imagine her panic when I'm gone. Who will feed these kids? Who will clothe these kids? Who will educate these kids? I am their only support. And then the last scene. She's dying, her kids are gathered around her bed, and she reminds them, really as her dying words, don't forget to water them geraniums. Well, for me, I realised even on her deathbed, in a coma, my grandmother was passing on her values. Whoever you are, whatever money you make, whatever fame, whatever self-importance, whatever the measures are in our very consumer society, actually, the real measure is what have you done about relationships? Have you nourished community? Those daily, pedestrian, unnoticed small things. They are the measure of what you amount to. So when it comes to thinking about the future of community, right through human history, I don't think it's changed. The need is profoundly the same need. And we need to be those who water those geraniums. I think out the back there are a couple of my books. If anyone wants them, the proceeds go to World Vision. Thank you for listening.